So I have the task to introducing John. What does one say? That hasn't already been said or inferred. So he holds a chair in practical theology and pastoral care at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Most of you who are familiar with his writing are probably struck by the breadth of topics that he addresses, from nursing to ministry to health chaplaincy. And if you've read those works, you're probably also struck by the depth and the degree to which he's able to call our attention to those issues that matter most. So we're excited to hear from him today. What you may not know is he has 5 children. Is that all of them? Did I count for all of them? 5. And he's also just wrapped up a sabbatical where he has been working on a book tentatively titled Living in the Memories of God. So if you'll join me in welcoming John.
Good morning. Is Jeremy here? Jeremy? Yeah. I've got a book coming out, Jeremy. Yes. It's called Living in the Memories of God. It's all about the theology and dementia. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real pleasure to get the opportunity to spend time with you guys, but also to be able to be Tom Reynolds for a day. I did think about not shaving this morning, but then you probably have seen through my cunning disguise. The topic I want to speak about this morning, I hope is interesting and useful in a number of different ways. But before we get into it, I just want to set the context. I'm a practical theologian. Put simply, practical theology is theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to enabling faithful discipleship. That's a rough definition of how we may understand practical theology. But one of the interesting things that practical theologians do is, it's a scholarly discipline, but it's a scholarly discipline that asks different questions. And so whereas a systematic theologian might ask what a particular concept or tradition might be, and a biblical scholar might ask what a particular word might mean, a practical theologian will take on board all of these things, but add one other question. What does it look like? So what does theology look like is a primary practical theological question. And what I want to do this morning with you is, if you like, an exercise in practical theology focused on the theology of disability, because actually the two come together really neatly. The theology of disability, as Debbie has very clearly laid out in her presentations, has to do with enabling people with disabilities to ask questions of the tradition and the practices of the church, which haven't been asked before. Because when we look at the tradition, when we look at the way in which we interpret Scripture, as Jeremy showed very clearly yesterday, it's written from a perspective. They say all history is written from the perspective of power, and it's probably not dissimilar with some aspects of theology. So the theology of disability looks at how can we enable the broad range of disability to ask questions of the tradition. Now this morning I want to focus specifically on autism and ask the question, what can autism and what can reflection on the experiences of people with autism do in enabling us to understand the tradition more clearly? Now, I don't want to develop a new theology of disability. I want really to see how disability, in this case autism, impacts upon things that we assume we already know about theology. And in particular, what I'm interested in is love. I like love. Love is good. You obviously don't agree, but then I think love's nice. Because love is one of these words that we use a lot. I'm not sure we know what it means. It's like relationality. We use the word relationality a lot. Do we really know what that means? We use it in relation to God. We use it in relation to Trinity, in relation to community. But what does it really mean? And where do we get our understandings of what it might mean? And so if you want a subtext to what I'm going to be talking about today, it's this. What does love look like? What does love look like? So with all of that as background, let me just get into where we're going. So autism. Autism is a condition where relationships are perceived in quite different terms from societal norms. Some would argue that people with autism do not and cannot relate. And I want to challenge that. I want to challenge that in a particular way. But I also want to offer a challenge to conventional assumptions about what human relationality looks like. And conventional assumptions in particular of what love might look like. Human beings, it's common for us to assume that to be human is to be relational. Human beings are made, we presume, for relationships, made in the image of a Trinitarian God who is relationship. We're created out of love and for love, and all of that seems quite natural. Until we ask the question, what is love? What is this thing that we're created out of and we're supposed to engage in? Because I can be guaranteed if I went round this room and asked you all to define what love is, you'd all give me different perspectives. Apart from you, Holly, because you know. We're used to believing that human beings are made in the image of God, who is a Trinity, and who is relationship, and who is love. What does that mean? We're much less used to thinking through precisely what such relationships should look like, and how such an understanding relates to those for whom relationships may not be central to the way in which they perceive the world and perceive themselves. What does it mean for those who appear to be pretty uninterested in relationships, at least as we may conventionally define them, to be made in the image of a God who seems to be relationships? So what is love? I once wrote a song called What is Love? I used to play in a rock band for many years, you know. And if you were my Facebook... No, you wouldn't like that, that's right. But if we have a wine party later... But if you were my Facebook friends, you would be able to see me looking remarkably like Freddie Mercury. Except that he's black. So, what is love? For Jesus, the gospel is all about love. In Matthew 22:34-40, we encounter some words from Jesus that are both revolutionary and mysterious. Quote, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And just as a sidebar, I had a very interesting conversation with a rabbi last week who was discussing this very passage and its origins, who was putting forward the argument that actually in the original Hebrew, and maybe the rabbi here will be able to clarify this, it's not mind but might. And that's not insignificant when we're dealing with people with, okay. So Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God, to love one another, and to love ourselves. Everything else hangs on that basic presupposition. Loving God compels us to love others and demand also that we love ourselves. And loving ourselves is pretty tricky, but you've always got to remember, Jesus says you've got to love yourself. So don't forget that. Now that probably sounds fairly familiar to those of us coming from the Christian tradition. It appears to be quite straightforward until we ask, what does that love look like? Because love is one of these words which is both powerful and contextually defined. I love my wife, I love my children, I love ice cream, I love going to the movies. I spend my life loving things. So much so that the word ends up meaning absolutely nothing. Or not as much as it should do. Joseph Pieper, a scholar of Thomas Aquinas, defines love in this way. He says, love is to say to the other, it's good that you exist, I am glad that you are here. It's good that you exist, I'm glad that you're here. I quite like that. It's quite helpful. It suggests that love is an attitude, an act of will, wherein I make a conscious decision to welcome the other. It's good that you exist, and I'm glad that you are here. Okay? But is love a noun or an adjective? Is it something we see and look at, or is it something that we do? Is it a feeling? If it is a feeling, then it's not a very firm foundation on which to base the kingdom of God. Sometimes I feel like I'm in love, other times I don't. If love is a feeling, then it's tenuous, transient, and pretty uncertain. Are we called to love God and others when we feel that way inclined? And yet, as one reflects on some of our contemporary images of love, one could be forgiven for assuming that love has primarily to do with feelings and emotions. The idea of romantic love underpins many of our perceptions about the nature of love and about the nature of God. When we think of Trinity, for example, we think a kind of romantic, communal, peaceful model. Prince Charming is forever riding through our dreams of perception as we wander through the dreamy corridors of love. Prince Charming doesn't necessarily translate if you're a man, but the principle probably does. Well, it might do. But such an understanding of love is quite new culturally, and requires an economic climate which can sustain the amount of time that's required to nurture such loving relationships. If you're in a situation of great poverty, want, and need, you just don't have the time to be able to develop that particular form of relationship. Now, my point is not that poor people can't love. My point is that many of our cultural images of love are exactly that, cultural images of love that come out of a situation of economic well-being. In Jesus' time, I suspect many of the people that he spoke to wouldn't recognize some of the ways in which we understand love. So, presumably, that's not where he's pushing towards. But even if we have time, is love really an emotion, a feeling, or an experience? Is that what Jesus is telling us? That we should feel a certain way about God and one another. So when the Apostle John in 1 John 4:8 tells us that God is love, does he mean that God's an emotion, a feeling, and an experience? You would expect not, or suspect not. And yet very often when we Christians think about love, it's precisely such experiences, emotions, and feelings that come to mind. Now, we could at this point proceed in the kind of standard academic way. We could begin to do a linguistic study of the meaning of the word love. We could look at the meaning of eros or philia or agape and work from there, from that textual basis, towards an understanding of what Jesus might or might not have meant by the term love. Now, that would be, and indeed, of course, is a valid approach to resolving the issue. However, in this paper, I want to experiment with a different approach to working through what love might mean. One which takes seriously what it is textually and in terms of its lexical, what would the word be? Lexicographical roots. Does that sound about right? Hey, I'm becoming one of them. Ooh. I'm glad I met you, Jeremy. My life's just never going to be the same. It's just fantastic. Eschatology. So the approach I want to develop entails developing what we might call a disability hermeneutic that emerges from the experience of people with autism. Now, Debbie explained what hermeneutic meant earlier on. It simply means a way of interpreting the word love that begins with the experience, or takes seriously the experience of people with autism. I want to help us together to reflect on why we think about love in the ways that we do, and why voices from the autistic spectrum might be challenging us to rethink what it means to love God, to love one another, and to love ourselves. In so doing, I hope to begin to expand our perspective on love and open up new possibilities, and to suggest that there may be a new discourse of love emerging as we listen to and engage with this particular form of human experience. Now, let's have a little think about what autism actually is. The three main areas of difficulty that are highlighted in relation to autism, it is claimed, all people with autism share, is sometimes called the triad of impairments. They are difficulty with social communication, difficulty with social interaction, difficulty with social imagination. Now, any definition or any explanation of human experience that begins with three difficulties, you should automatically be suspicious of. So underneath these issues of communication, interaction, and imagination lies this, what's come to be known as the theory of mind. The theory of mind works something like this. The assumption is that in order for us to communicate well, I need to be able to read your mind, and you need to be able to read my mind. And so therefore, when I'm watching you guys, I'm making certain inferences and assumptions from your body language, from your eye contact, from the things I know about you, from the things I project onto you. In other words, I assume that you have a mind something similar to mine, although I would doubt that to be the case, but that can only be a blessing. And so, for example, if I'm looking at you, and I'm looking at you, Holly, and I see your pupils dilate, and then you're saying, what a handsome guy that is. Yeah. And then you're saying, I wish, handsome. What a frickin' American, as you put it like. It's like Holly, now I have to explain that in case people think I'm being rude. Holly did a presentation last night, and she has a tendency to put a hyphen between the A and the F in African American. And it completely changes the meaning of it. And so that's a hermeneutical dilemma for you to solve. And then Hans is looking at me and he's saying, that guy's a genius. Thank the Lord that I had to present my paper first, because after this it would be awful. And Jeremy is saying, I wonder if John's going to remember to mention my book. And so on and so forth. In other words, in order to be able to communicate well, you need to be able to read the mind of the people in front of you. The problem for many people with autism, it is argued, is that they're not able to read people's minds, so therefore they get confused and can't understand social communication in the ways that we've been talking about. So they have no theory of mind, it is argued. So therefore, this triad of impairments, communication, interaction, and imagination becomes significant. Now, I want to push that theory. I want to give it a prod, and I want to see how strong it might actually be. I'm not pushing it away. I'm just giving it a prod. In order to do that, I want to use two stories to help us to get into the issues. In a brief but nonetheless fascinating paper titled Horses Live to Run, What About People?, Christine Guth now, I thought it was Guth, but you told me it was Guth. That's very good. Right. Is that an American name? Where does that come from? Mennonite. Fantastic. Christine Guth reflects on her experience with what she describes as her autistic family. Guth, in essence, tries to think through the question of what it means to be a human being. She notes that there was a time when she thought she had the answer to that question. Quote, I once had my own easy answer to this question. Something like this description by Martha Beck. To me, being human was a part of us that makes our brief, improbable little lives worth living. The ability to reach through our own isolation and find strength and comfort and warmth for and in each other. This is what human beings do. This is what we live for, the way that horses live to run. The capacity for relationship was, I thought, the most valuable aspect of human experience and how we reflect the image of God. End of quote. Now, Guth's initial position on the centrality of relationships for love will strike an intuitive chord of agreement with many of us. Human beings live to relate, but then she says, things changed. Quote, my Asperger family led me to throw out all such assumptions and start over. First, both our children were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a condition on the autism spectrum, a disorder affecting a person's ability to socialize and communicate with others. Then my husband, Bob, also claimed the diagnosis. Surrounded by people on the autism spectrum, I began to wonder how God's good creation could include people with brain differences that limit ability to form relationships. What could it mean to be human when some folks cannot relate in the ways that meet expectations? I concluded in frustration that the people I love with all my heart are a completely different kind of human being, incomprehensibly other. End of quote. Guth gently describes the relational differences that she encountered with her autistic husband. And this is important. Well, I've got to point that out in case you don't think it's important. But this is kind of key. Quote, long before we had a name for it, Asperger differences were already colouring Bob's and my relationship. During our courtship, Bob and I had caused a pastoral counsellor to wonder at his lack of being in love and to worry about our future together. For decades to follow, including the trying years I described above, I wondered too, where was the love in this strange relationship? Now, after 28 years of marriage, I know that love is here too, though his love for me has pulverized my preconceived notions and stereotypes of love. Who am I to say it does not qualify as love? Bob's version of love is marked by dogged commitment, persistence through agonizing struggles, willingness to give and take enjoyment of companionship and other treasured aspects of shared living. Folks with Asperger's thrive on predictability, so their love may shine in predictable routines. Bob's commitment to spending the last half hour of every evening with me, reviewing the day's ups and downs, has, in its very reliability, breathed new life into our marriage. Likewise, I have learned that Bob values when I express my love for him predictably. When I make sure the refrigerator always holds the items he invariably carries in his lunch, he feels my care. Who says you need roses for romance? Isn't that interesting? Quite a different perspective from what love looks like. Predictability, routine, commitment, willful conversations. This is a very different description of love and loving relationships from Guth's original emotional, relational perspective. Although I guess if one looks at the way in which the contemplative church fathers and mothers lived their lives loving God, marked as they were with predictability, routine, spiritual discipline, boredom, and willful commitment to what appears to be the mundane, you can see it's in the tradition. It's just a part of the tradition that we've either forgotten or we no longer find very, well, sexy, attractive. For Guth's Asperger family, loving relationships are not marked by warmth, empathy, and mutuality, but by concrete actions that produce predictable, stable situations within which people come together, but not in a romantic or even necessarily a warm way, at least not in the conventional sense of these terms. These relationships are quite different from the perceived norm, but no less poignant and significant for that. If we are to make the statement that human beings are made for relationships, we need to add the proviso that while all people need relationships, not all people live to relate. Guth puts it this way: what is it that people live to do the way horses live to run? My family members on the autism spectrum show me that we dare not limit our definition of humanity to a single trait. Being with God is beyond relationality. Being with God is beyond relationality. And this is a vital point. Is there a danger that we have a tendency, or we learned a tendency, to develop pathological forms of hyper-relationality when we're thinking about what love is? Hyper-relationality means being an overemphasis on a single aspect of love, which we then make the whole of it and act accordingly. Guth says this: human beings live to share emotional closeness, yes. We also live for the thrill of learning, the comfort of daily routine, the pleasure of intellectual challenge, the joy of creating functional items and works of art, the satisfaction of analysing and understanding systems, the pursuit of passionate interests and more. The diversity that folk on the autism spectrum bring to the human race explodes our narrow, universal, in inverted commas, pronouncements. The richness of God's image is greater than we understand, far greater than we can imagine. End of quotation. So, to love God is to keep your house tidy. To love God is to live a life that is routine and ordered. To love one another is to make sure that each night at exactly the same time you will sit down and have a conversation about the day. A willful conversation, ordered and predictable, and within which no offence is caused. Love is a form of action. Love is a mode of routine. It's good that you exist. I'm glad that you are here. I recently had a conversation with a person who has autism in and around these very issues. Now, during that conversation, I asked the question, do you think that people with autism express their love for people differently from those who do not have autism? Now, her answer is interesting, and I'll quote her at some length. Why, yes, I do, she says. But different doesn't equal worse. Gosh, how best to explain this? Let me think by way of example. My own lovely husband, and he won't mind me using him as an illustration of this. He's on the autism spectrum, as of course am I. Neither of us are on the mild end. If one reads the popular articles from the researchers and psychologists, one would imagine that some cold, logic-driven, rule-based existence with each other, but not a bit of it. We cannot see each other's expressions, nor hear each other's tones of voice that well in theory of mind. So we've had to learn to use words to express our love, and touch, and gifts, and share time and holidays and breaks and hours and meals, and all other elements of a full relationship spent wonderfully together. By learning to be really clear about what we need, we've rebuilt ways around each of the challenges from not having those central instincts and abilities to decode each other. Do we feel love, she says? Goodness me, yes. But our brains are often wired in ways that make it so hard to link particular words and phrases directly to the feeling of love. We may have to find workarounds such as touch or other senses that will link in more easily. I find it so hard to convert words into emotions directly. For me, I have to use touch or images, etc. But the end feeling of love is exactly the same, or at least I expect. Because those in the autism spectrum are people of great passionate intensity in so much of our lives. A love of our life, if one occurs, is often something absolutely wonderful, a great and unmissable joy. End of quotation. Now you can see the tension there between what the theory of mind says people with autism across the spectrum should be experiencing and these narratives that say something else is going on. So there's a lot of really interesting things that we could draw out of these two stories. But for current purposes, I want to focus only on one dimension. It's clear that, at least for the people in these two situations, and contrary to many people's assumptions about autism, love and relationships, differently defined, are important, but differently expressed. Now, I'm not trying to draw inferences from these two stories for all autistic people. It's said that if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person, and I think that's a good principle to bear in mind for most of us. But there's something interesting in these stories. Why is it that we have this perception that relationships and autism are almost like bipolar opposites, whereas when we listen to the stories of many people with autism, something else is going on? And in order to understand why that might be, we need to begin by thinking about how it is that we come to know the things that we know about autism. In a series of articles and lectures, the American philosopher Ian Hacking has put forward a really interesting thesis relating to the ways in which autism narratives, the stories that people with autism and their families are telling, are forming and reforming our understanding of what autism is. These stories, as they emerge in personal testimonies, in autobiographies, in blogs, in very many different ways, all are creating autism in quite a different way from traditional understandings of what autism is. So autobiographies written by people such as Temple Grandin. Have you guys come across Temple Grandin? Very interesting. There's a new movie out, which you should have a look at. You'll get some very interesting and shocking insights into autism. So autobiographies such as those written by Temple Grandin and Donna Williams have been described by Oliver Sacks as shocking insofar as they present a perspective on the inner life of people with autism which was not available previously, and indeed which was not previously thought to be possible So these stories are given insights that previously nobody had, but also nobody thought was possible, assumed that didn't exist. Hacking suggests that autism narratives are not just stories or histories describing a given reality, autism. They are creating the language in which to describe the experience of autism, and hence helping to forge concepts in which to think about autism. So these stories are not just reflecting experience, they're actually creating what autism is and giving us a new language to speak about what autism is. So often such accounts are presented as giving insight into autism, autism from the inside, whatever that might mean. Hacking argues that they are in fact doing much more than this, if in fact they're doing that in the first place. What such narratives are doing is creating and developing ways to describe experience for which there is little existing language, apart from the language of pathology, of course. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, and you guys may be familiar with it, there's a publisher, a London publisher, which is called Jessica Kingsley, which has a huge catalogue of books on autism, written by people with autism, families, caregivers, and so on and so forth. Hacking's argument would point towards Jessica Kingsley's catalogue and say that catalogue is not simply reflecting the experiences of people with autism and those who surround them, it's actually creating autism in a very powerful way. So parents read books of fiction about autism, and they learn a new language about autism, a new language for expressing the experiences of their day-to-day life. Previously, they're limited to the language of medicine and pathology and difficulty. Now they learn a new language, and as soon as you learn that new language, so you look at people differently. Autism comes into existence not simply by being looked at, but also by being read about. Professionals read stories about autism and suddenly notice different things in the people they're working alongside. Things which were previously invisible and for which they had no previous language that enabled them to notice it or express it. Some of these new biographical and autobiographical narratives stand in contrast and contradiction to the established stories. And it's quite interesting when you look at some of the literature around this, and particularly the literature that responds to that obvious challenge to the theory of mind. So you get somebody like Temple Grandin, who is very articulate, expresses the story. The response is predictable. She's misdiagnosed. And so the theory becomes so powerful that anything that challenges it is simply pushed to the side. So rather than expanding our understanding of what autism is, the theory itself keeps us focused on what we always assume, or those who are powerful assume it to be. So the narratives challenge the theory. The theory is powerfully lodged within the medical narrative. Therefore, the stories that people with autism tell are necessarily perceived as flawed and, as Sachs says, shocking. Now, Hacking suggests that this literature of autism stories is moving autistic people from being thin people who are assumed to have very little inner life and very little emotional life to thick people who have lives that are surprisingly rich in their depth and breadth. And this idea of moving between thin and thick people is really important, not just for what I'm talking about just now, but for disability studies in particular. If you notice the way in which people with disabilities are constructed, it's very thin. Look at the legislation, there's thin people that are there, people with disabilities with no emotions, no feeling, no experiences, no possibilities, and so on and so forth. Part of what disability theology wants to do is to help create thick people that we can see properly. So that thin and thick distinction is very important. So if we think about the two stories that I began with, we can begin to see how these narratives too begin to expand the thickness of autistic perspectives on love. Far from being thin people with little propensity for love, these narratives give us a new language for love that significantly thickens our understanding of autistic love. So why is it, with all of that stuff in mind, why is it that people tend to think of those with autism as thin people? It's not an accident. There's something going on. Why is it that people tend to think of those with autism as thin people? In answering this question, Hacking draws upon the thinking of the German Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Kohler. Gestalt's a good name. Can you all please say Gestalt? Hans, could you say Gestalt? It takes a Dutchman to do it properly. Although I'm not suggesting you're German, you understand. Although you did describe yourself as a proto-German once, which I thought was quite interesting. Don't know what it means. Kohler. Kohler observes that not only the so-called expressive movements, but also the practical behaviour of human beings is a good picture of their inner life in many cases. And this he anticipates Wittgenstein's later aphorism, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. So the theory of mind suggests that we pick up cues and we infer things from these cues and we read one another's minds. What Kohler is saying is that most of the time we know exactly what's going on in somebody else's mind because it's written all over your face. No, you see it rather than infer it, is his key point. If a friend is startled by a loud noise, we don't infer the emotion of fear, we see it. If someone is in pain, we don't infer the feeling of pain, we see it. If someone is upset because we ask them to do something, we see it rather than infer it from their actions. Now, Hacking calls this phenomenon Kohler's phenomena. This is the way that we make sense of our encounters with others. However, as Kohler's phenomena, this idea that we can know what others are thinking by just seeing them, is precisely what, it's argued, people with autism do not seem to have, or at least struggle to attain. Hacking says that expert observers report that autistic children do not see that someone is in a bad humour. They do not follow the direction of a startled person's gaze. They do not readily understand what another person is doing. That is, they do not easily recognise intentions. End of quote. However, it's important to note that the so-called neurotypical people, and the neurotypical people are people who don't have autism, who it's presumed by the term that they have a typical form of neurology. It's more to note that so-called neurotypical people also cannot see the minds and feelings of people with autism. Isn't that interesting? They cannot see through behaviour, through the behaviour of severely autistic people, Hacking says, what they feel, what they want, what they're thinking. Even more disturbing is an inability to see what they're doing. Their intentions make no sense. They're taken to be thin children who grow up to be thin men and women lacking a thick emotional life, or so it has seemed to most people, including many parents and many clinicians. And the way that you could frame that is that what you're experiencing there is the autism of the neurotypical, or neurotypical autism. Because precisely the same criteria that we use to define what autism is precisely the same experience that we have when we encounter a person with autism. As Kohler's phenomena are absent from encounters with people with autism, it's necessary to compensate for that absence, Hacking tells us. Hence, he suggests that the importance of autism narrative, because they compensate for that mind blindness, that double mind blindness. They open up places that we couldn't access otherwise. They enable us to overcome the double mind blindness of autistic people and neurotypicals, and open up new areas for conversation by providing new forms of language. And as we begin to think about developing new forms of language, so we're going to move back into rethinking what love might look like. Hacking tells us that there is a partial symmetry between the autistic and the non-autistic. Neither can see what the other is doing. The symmetry is only partial because we have an age-old language for describing what the non-autistic are feeling, thinking and so on, but are only creating one for the autistic. Now his point is, and I'll come back to this in a second, his point is there that we have learned through our culture over time to talk about relations and emotions with a particular form of language, which has created our understanding of what these emotions and feelings are. But to date, that language has only been created by neurotypicals. And what he's saying is by listening to these narratives from people from across the autistic spectrum, a new language is emerging. And it's at this point, the suggestion that we have an age-old language for describing what non-autistic people are feeling, that takes us back to the issue of autistic love. In his essay, How We've Been Learning to Talk About Autism, Hacking observes that we take for granted that there is an immense and age-old language for human experience, emotions, and intentions. One that must go back to our most distant ancestors, and one that is being honed every day in both the street and the garret. But a quarter of a century ago, there was no language for autistic experience, emotions, or intentions. It didn't exist. In other words, we learn how to talk about things. In communities and over time, we develop language that expresses how we see and understand the world. To date, all of that language has related to the experience of neurotypical people. And so when we think of love, we think of neurotypical love. We couldn't do anything else. And when we look at love in Scripture, we think of neurotypical love. We therefore assume that that is how the world is, and that other perspectives are somehow odd or pathological, and of course they're not. We just haven't had a language for it. What the growing body of narrative literature around autism is doing is creating a new language about autism, which in turn is creating a new language about love. This language of love has been created by neurotypical people with a particular perception of the centrality of a certain form of relationality. That, it is assumed, reflects true humanness and ultimately reflects the relationships of God even within the Trinity. To date, there has not been a recognizable language of love that includes the types of autistic experiences of love that are highlighted at the beginning of my paper. Emotional and relational definitions of love make people with autism out to be thin lovers. But the type of stories we listened to earlier show that, in fact, they are thick lovers who present us with a different dimension of love, one which is countercultural, but nonetheless authentic. Now, if that's so, then listening to the stories of people with autism may actually be the beginning of opening up a new discourse about the nature of love. Such an observation has significant implications for the development of what we might describe as a practical theology of love. Now, I don't have time to outline in great detail what a practical theology of love might look like, but I want to give you some pointers and some possibilities. In 1 John 4:8, the Apostle tells us that God is love. Now, it's critical that we get the movement of this dynamic right. Dietrich Bonhoeffer notes that we cannot understand God's love in terms of behavior, disposition, dedication, sacrifice, feeling, passion, service, or deed. All of these things can exist without love. You can look like a loving person, you can do all of these things, and they can exist quite well without any necessity for love. In other words, many of the accepted standard characteristics of what love is, how love is manifested, and what love looks like really don't reveal love at all, or at least they don't necessarily accompany love. So what then is love? Bonhoeffer answers the question in this way, quote, God is love, 1 John 4:16. For the sake of clarity, this sentence must first be read with the emphasis on the word God, even though we have become accustomed to emphasize the word love. God is love. That is, love is not a human behavior, sentiment, or deed, but it is God who is love. What love is can be known only by one who knows God. The reverse is not true. That one would first know what love is, that is from nature, and therefore also know what God is. But nobody knows God except one to whom God reveals himself. Thus, nobody knows what love is except through God's self-revelation. Love is therefore God's self-revelation. And it's really, really important that we get the significance of that. 2 dimensions. Love is not God. God is love. God is the definition of what love is. And love is a gift that is given to human beings by God. One of the things that I'm sure everybody in this room would be concerned about is the way in which definitions of personhood are constructed according to capacities. The capacity to think, to relate, to have a sense of yourself over time, and so on and so forth. And if you don't have these capacities, then you're not human. What we need to be really careful of is that love itself doesn't become a capacity. And somehow a person with profound autism, for example, doesn't have that capacity. then we begin to question their humanness. Bonhoeffer says, that's not even an issue. Love is therefore a gift in which we participate rather than a set of formal fixed features that we enact or achieve. It's from this primal gift of love that all other manifestations of love take their shape and form. The diversity of ways of loving revealed in the lives of people with autism is but a reflection on the diversity of possibilities that exist for God's creatures in a world that was created out of love and for love. We should therefore be very careful when we suggest that someone cannot love because they don't act or respond in the ways we have been conditioned into thinking are representative of love. And you can see there's some implications there also for the exclusion of people with autism from the sacraments. We can maybe talk about that more. We should be very careful not to go by what we think we see. So, God is not an emotion, a feeling, an experience, and Jesus is not a relationship. He encompasses both, but is not defined by either. So too with human love. It's a gift that's received and in which we participate in a multitude of different ways. Autism narratives remind us of the shape and importance of the diversity of love. The way of love revealed in Christ is diverse, deep, and open, even though a severely autistic person is both encompassed by that love and reveals that love. And perhaps it's that last part of that sentence that's most complicated, and reveals that love. Bonhoeffer again says this: love is not a human behaviour, but God's. Within this understanding, love is not defined or constituted by a particular human behaviour or attitude. Love is defined and constituted by God's action of reconciliation through Jesus Christ. In Christ, the disunion of human beings from God, from other human beings, from the world and from themselves has ended. Their origin has once again been given back to them as gift. Love thus denotes what God does to human beings to overcome the disunion in which they live. The deed is called Christ, he says. It's called reconciliation. Love is something that happens to human beings, something passive. I think there's something very, very important and powerful, particularly when we're talking about people with profound autism. So the shape of human love is not found in relationships, emotions, or any other human capacity. Love is encountered and defined as we move towards reconciliation with God in Christ. The question then is not, can people with autism love and share emotions, feelings, and relationships as per the standard triad of deficits? The autistic narratives of love indicate that for many, and who knows, perhaps for all, the answer is simply that they can. The interesting question, and this is a research question, if anybody's looking for a good research question, the interesting question is, how do people with autism know and love God? There's something deep and important about that. So coming towards the very end of what I want to say to you, there are therefore multitudes of ways in which love can be embodied in relationships, in emotions, in structures, in intellectual concepts and procedures. All of these things are valid revelations of human love. Now this might help to explain the rather mysterious inclusion of administration in Paul's list of the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians 16. Why would administration be an aspect of love? Looking after the mundane structural things within the church is as much an act of love as encouragement, teaching, mercy, patience, grace, charity, administration. The authenticity of a loving action is not gauged by its emotionality or by human relationality, but rather by its direction, its movement towards God, and from there towards one another and self. And I think that's really where Jesus is pushing towards, isn't it? Because if God is love, and in that passage we looked at, and everything else falls off the back, your relationship with your neighbour, your relationship with yourself, falls off the back of God's graceful movement towards you. It is this divine dynamic that moves us towards reconciliation with God, self, and one another. That's the linchpin of love. Autistic narratives of love reveal clearly that this movement involves relationality, but is also clearly not defined by it. More than that, such a perspective makes it clear that autistic people not only share in the love of God, which is a given for all human beings, but can reveal and act out that love in ways that previously those of us who do not claim the label of autistic have been unable to do so. Listening to the stories of love, of autistic love, will provide a new language to speak authentically about autistic love and about all love. And also, another research question, what would it look like if we began to rethink our doctrine of the Trinity and incorporate autistic love? It will also help us to develop both language and practices that will enable all of us to realize that loving God, neighbour and self is a practical task that requires the perspective of all people before we can understand what it might mean and what it might look like. Of course, for a good Presbyterian boy like myself, suggesting that works and routines might actually be an aspect of love and salvation is quite challenging. But that's a challenge of disability theology, because it pushes your own theological position into strange and awkward positions and forces you to make a decision. You can either hold on to your old tradition in all of its fullness and ignore the voice of disability, or you can say, there's something dissonant here. What do I do with it? So that's the challenge that autistic love brings with it. Our old certainties are unsettled and newer, deeper truths become possible. Human love emerges from and reflects divine love, but as God is spirit, the physical shape of love in the material world will necessarily be diverse and open. But its goal is nonetheless clear: to love God, to love one another, and to love ourselves in all of the ways that Jesus calls us to do so. Such is the nature of love, and such is the nature of salvation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for prodding this morning,
Prodding's good.
And for the compelling introducing us to this discourse on love. Appreciate that. And want to spend a little time hearing your reflections and thoughts before we break for lunch, and I'm sure there'll be many. So.
First off, John, thank you very much for that tremendous talk. It was wonderful. It got me thinking, actually, in terms of, the biblical theological component. That could really add a very profound reading to, say, the book of Deuteronomy. In terms of what does love, love is all over the place in Deuteronomy. Yeah. But, it resonates a lot more with the illustrations you were using at the beginning of your lecture, about what love looks like with those particular relationships. Yeah. So that could really, I think, add a very profound and deep reading to the book of Deuteronomy. That would really be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, well, if you ever fancy a joint research project, But it is interesting. We could do another one. Hoisted on my own petard. It's outrageous. But the important point is, and this is something I hope people get from this whole week, is that there is a strong connection between systematic theology, biblical studies, in their pure and natural form, and the kind of practical theology that I'm opening up today. We need to work together. I think that's a great observation.
John, I kept thinking halfway through your talk of the Hebrew, the central Hebrew expression for God of steadfast love, as we translate it, or chesed, or however that's pronounced, that complex notion in the Hebrew scriptures, which is impossible of, I guess, rendering, but it has to do with steadiness, it has to do with persistence, yet it encompasses all the relational aspects too, but of the God who persistently hangs in there when I'm have checked out. And to me, that just kept coming back and back and back, that the kind of love has a tradition to it, even in the Hebrew scriptures, the steady love, the reliable love. And I also then made it connect the dots with, for Martin Luther and his personal experience, it was only the reliability of God that enabled him to make that leap of, well, I guess I better trust that I'm okay.
Yeah.
So that the reliability of the other becomes the unconditional love.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I mean, two things. One, I'm not saying relationality in the way that we understand it is wrong, throw it all out. I'm just saying it needs to be expanded and understood that the manifestations of autism are love, as much as me embracing you is love. But it's in the tradition. I mean, you're pointing out to the idea of Hesed, God's unchanging love, and that includes administration, that includes order, that includes a clear movement towards a fixed goal, which is much more than just, oh, maybe I'll take this, maybe I won't, isn't it nice to be here? There's something else going on there. And also, if you look at, you can see it in Luther and you can see it in Calvin, there's a lot of what you might call autistic thinking that goes on there, or thinking that people with autism could probably identify with quite well in that sense. But we tend to not look for it or not see it because we're not primed to see the significance of it. Yeah.
Christine Guth is actually a personal friend of mine.
Really?
And I appreciated you sharing that this morning. And if anybody's interested in more of her writings and things, you can Google ADNET, capital A, small d, capital N-E-T. And just her insight into theology and disability, living with a husband and two sons with Asperger's is just phenomenal. So if you're interested in reading more of her things,
that's really helpful.
Go on that.
Adnet.com.
Yeah. Well, just Google ADNET.
Okay. Oh, ADNET Online, it says, apparently.
What is it?
No. ADNETonline.org.
Yeah.
An angel told me.
And she's also open about her own struggle with mental illness in relation to some of that. So,
as a Catholic voice, and saying not either or, it's a both and, acknowledging God's grace, and so it's not just by action. Rick Gallardi wrote a really interesting book, a Catholic theologian, wrote an interesting book on marriage, and he said that actually in marriage we work out our salvation in our relationship with our spouse. And I think that translates also to just our relationship with each other. I mean, because very often I'll hear people I interpret it as a romantic sort of how much value they get out of experience encountering someone with a disability, realizing that there's a person there, and just how they're drawn out of themselves. Yeah. How I'm drawn out of the limits of my own worldview and agenda. I'm just drawn into acknowledging the needs and also the person before me who used to be other. But that's not just with people with disabilities, it's with all of us that we're called to that. But then there is also, I won't say exclusively, but the theory of mind is not regularly or it's not the only discussion with autism. I mean, actually, there's another definition of autism that doesn't engage the imagination, reference the imagination at all. And it adds instead, there's this social interaction, communication, and unusual stereotypic behaviors. So, and we're focused on that. And Stephen Shore, who you quoted when you said, when you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. He shared a story about figuring out, and Stephen Shore is probably had a similar youth experience, I think, to Temple Grandin in terms of symptoms, but now has a doctorate in special education. But he would notice feeling discomfort and trying to figure out what the problem was because there was nothing going on in his life that was a problem, and figuring out that he was picking up on the emotions of his wife, and that she was upset, and so kind of having to learn that, which I think challenges the theory of mind.
Yeah.
So. Thank you for bringing up the importance of experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the theory of mind, the reason I focus on the theory of mind because it's a powerful theory, and the key thing for everybody to think about is that we should challenge powerful theories, or at least give them a prod and see what's really going
on. Your presentation reminded me that it isn't only people with autism who may not be able to communicate what's inside or may have a different perspective on life. And many of us, those with official disabilities and those without disabilities, very often can't demonstrate what's inside our hearts. And when we as clergy or as educators reach out to everyone in our communities, but especially people with disabilities, we need to look beyond the words, and we need to look at the actions, or we tend to interpret things the way we want to interpret them. And we want to assume that there's a certain type of relationship. And if a particular action is performed that meets our expectations, then right away that equals, well, the person understands. And in my experience with people with developmental disabilities and people who have traumatic brain injury and, other types of issues beyond autism or in, without autism, many of these same issues are the same. Friendship is seen as a totally different type of experience for many of them, and so our expectations that my daughter be able to find a best friend just isn't correct, and she operates on a different level of what friendship and love and relationship mean to her because of who she is and where she's at. And so I need to really take a step back and change expectations, and also find out who she is and celebrate her experience of friendship. So
exactly, and I think underlying what you're saying is in some sense, there's two things I would say. The rehabilitation model is alive and well in their understanding of what love is, because we tend to want to get, well, if they can come to our level of relationality, if we can only come down, they can relate in the way that we are, then we'll be comfortable that they're loving people in that sense. And part of what I want. And we just finished a project looking at the spiritual lives of people with profound and complex intellectual disabilities, people who don't have words. And use a mother. It's interesting because a number of the mothers in our study had exactly that same tension. They wanted a friendship as kind of culturally defined for their son or daughter, but the son or daughter either wasn't able or wanted something different, and it was a tension for them. Eventually they resolved it by rethinking, reframing what friendship looked like. She seems similar to you. But the second thing in response to what you're saying also is that there is a tendency for us to domesticate love. I mean, you come from the Jewish tradition, and you think about the life of Moses or Abraham. These weren't particularly easy lives. They've had warm and wonderful communities, and within the Christian tradition, the cross is at the center of what God's love means for the world. So therefore, I think it's easy for us to domesticate the word love. And I think if we listen to these kind of broader voices, then we can become rawer and more faithful, I think.
There's a really big resource in Pennsylvania, a guy named Bob Nassif, who's a parent, a father in Philadelphia, who's father of a child with autism, has done a lot with fathers and other people with autism. And Bob, one of the first things I learned from him was about the whole concept, and he talked about the whole concept of floor time. That what you do is, if you want to build a relationship, you get down on the floor with and communicate with the same kinds of gestures or moves that a person with autism might be making. And there's a wonderful Christmas reflection by Archbishop Rowan Williams about 1996, in which he describes incarnation at Christmas as God's floor time with us, and it just is a wonderful piece.
That's good. That's very good.
Okay. What I was saying was just the idea that when you were touching on the part when you're talking about like how from us to them not understanding, like what are they understanding, what are they not understanding, it almost is like you're flipping it, that in a sense, you know, for lack of a better description, for a moment we're autistic in a switch fashion that we also cannot understand. But what I'm trying to say is I think it's a real opportunity for us to understand the difficulty, and saying it's the same for them to understand, say, the facial expressions, the different, all the nonverbal communication, and what that means in the way that we all relate. It's such an opportunity to consider that, which is, I think, what you're saying in the way that we define that. But also, it's an opportunity. I think that a lot of times when we talk about one of the barriers for especially the church is that people do this avoidance, or they have what we term hesitancy in approaching people with disability because they're not sure how to communicate. Mm-hmm. Not so much that they can't communicate with us, but we don't know what would be acceptable in our communication with them. And I think it's a real opportunity to look at that and kind of breaking down that barrier a little bit more. But interestingly enough, I have two boys on the spectrum, and one year we had an exchange student, and I learned more that year about how I was communicating with my child when I had to watch how I was speaking to her and what she understood. Right. And like how many things was I saying that really wasn't that concrete, that I thought that I was saying, and she had the wherewithal to stop me and say, what? Or repeat what I would say, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, like I'm totally saying this. My poor child has to live with me every day. But it really brought that awareness and how unaware we are when we're communicating on a certain plane. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe I'm just blabbering. You know what I'm saying?
It sensitizes us to the kind of vacuousness of our talk about relationality. Because when you break it down, sometimes when you begin to look at yourself in the way that you relate, which we don't usually do, then exactly the issues that you talk about emerge. So when you start thinking about that, then it's clear that it's not just people with autism that you're talking about. It's all of us that have communicational difficulties around these issues.
Uh-huh.
Telling Christina a story. Telling Christina a story. Oh yes, yeah. Oh yes. Well, there's two things. Well, before can I just make a statement before, and then I'll tell the story. Yeah, it's a good story actually. If I can offer a critique of my own paper, I know it's difficult, and this is maybe something that we can pick up in the afternoon. Is that what I'm saying really is that these new voices are transforming our understanding of autism, giving us new language for autism, and ultimately giving us new language for love. But what about those who don't have language? What about these people who are severe in the autistic spectrum, for whom others in the spectrum now have become advocates? Advocates for something that they may not themselves experience. So is there a danger then that the new voices become very similar to the old voices in the sense that they become ideological and begin to determine what autism is across the board, and people with severe communication needs are excluded from that conversation? Secondly, how can we include them?
I'm trying to understand the point about the caller phenomena. One way of listening to what you just said was you haven't denied that people with autism have a problem in understanding or perceiving emotions. You haven't denied that. You have only redefined love in such a way that that doesn't really matter insofar as love is concerned. And it seems to me that's okay. But then I'm trying to think what is actually the point about the Kohler phenomena, otherwise than that it seems to imply that people with autism cannot see what there is plainly to see for everybody, namely anger on a face, for example. And I have a hard time, particularly when you look at first person accounts of people with autism, I have a hard time believing that. So here's another suggestion. People with autism have none of those difficulties except the one of communicating about it.
Well, I think that's quite a complicated question, but I'll answer the first part, and then I'll tell that story. The theory of mind assumes that we have certain cognitive and intuitive abilities to read the other person's mind. So you can read cues, and you infer from their behaviour what is going on there. Now, a friend of mine who's autistic said to me the other day that there's a real audacity in neurotypicals assuming that they can read minds, which I thought was quite interesting. The significance of the Colas phenomena is simply a way of illustrating the assumptions that those who consider themselves to be neurotypical perceive those who are autistic. And so therefore, they look at the person, they see that they don't respond in these ways, that they don't infer from behaviour, and so therefore they make assumptions. My point is that works both ways. Neither can infer anything from the other in that sense. Now, as to whether or not it's a communicational issue, I think that's a key point, and I think we'll keep that for the afternoon. As to whether or not it's all communication, or whether or not there really are significant issues that are more than beyond communication, and how do we deal with both of these issues? Okay, the story to finish before lunch is, as part of the project that I spoke to you about in profound and complex intellectual disabilities, people who don't have words or have very few words, I spent a few days in Trolly. Trolly is the L'Arche community in France, where L'Arche began, where Jean Vanier lives. And they were kind enough to invite me across to spend a few days just speaking to people and to get a sense about how they understood these issues. And L'Arche is it's a narrative community. Ask anybody in L'Arche and they'll tell you a story. But anything will tell you a story. And this person who lives in L'Arche told me this story. And it was about a young man called, I've forgotten what his name is, Pierre, I think, who had a heart condition. And he had to go down to Paris to see the cardiologist. And he went down to Paris, saw the cardiologist, and he came back. And the woman said to him, Pierre, where have you been? And he said, I've been to Paris. And she said, oh, what did you do there? I saw the doctor. I said, oh, you saw the doctor. And what did he do? And Pierre said, oh, he looked into my heart. And she said, well, and what did he see? He said, he saw Jesus. And she said, and what was he doing? He said, he was resting. Now I wonder if you look into the hearts of all the people in this room, whether Jesus rests in, or whether Jesus is more than a little anxious as he is when he sits within my heart. But it's a nice story, and there's something important about the simplicity of stories to capture big theological concepts about pneumatology or any other element to frame it. So thank you.